People always talk about making it like it's this big, loud explosion of champagne and fireworks. But if there's one thing I've learned sitting in rooms where the air smells like expensive cologne and desperation, it's that. Real bone-deep power is actually very quiet. And it usually happens right when you think someone is at their weakest. I remember this one Tuesday in Chicago, the kind of day where the wind off the lake feels like it's trying to peel the skin off your face. And I was sitting in the back of a boardroom on the top floor of the Sterling Vane Tower, which is basically just a giant glass middle finger to the rest of the city. I was there as a junior consultant, mostly just a fly on the wall, watching two worlds collide, and at the head of that table sat Margaret Sterling. A woman who didn't just run an airline empire, she breathed it, lived it, and used it to crush anyone she thought was beneath her. Margaret was the kind of person who wore a $4,000 suit like armor. Her hair sprayed into a silver helmet that didn't move even when she was screaming at her assistants. And today, she was supposed to be signing a deal that would save her company from a massive liquidity crisis. Across from her sat Alina Vance, a woman I'd admired from a distance for years because Alina didn't come from old money or country clubs. She had built her private equity firm Obsidian by grinding out 18-hour days in a studio apartment, until she was the one everyone had to call when their balance sheets started bleeding red. The room was tense. You could feel the static in the carpet. And when Alina stood up to finalize the $3 billion partnership, a move that would have literally kept Margaret's planes in the sky, she did what any professional would do. She smiled, a genuine warm smile, and reached her hand across that polished mahogany table. Now, you have to understand, everyone was watching this on a private internal stream for the shareholders. Thousands of people tuned in to see this historic handshake. But Margaret, she just sat there. She looked at Elena's hand like it was something she'd found stuck to the bottom of her shoe. And then she looked Elena dead in the eye, leaned back in her leather chair, said, "I'm sorry, dear, but I have a strict policy against physical contact with, let's call them, unrefined elements." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room by a vacuum. And I saw a couple of the VPs at the table actually smirk. One guy even let out this little condescending huff of a laugh. Thinking it was just Margaret being tough or classic Margaret, Elena's hands stayed there for a second too long, just hanging in the air, and for a heartbeat. I thought I saw her flinch, but then she just lowered it, very slowly, very deliberately, and she didn't look embarrassed. She looked like she was suddenly seeing a mathematical equation that finally made sense. Alina didn't storm out. She didn't yell. She just sat back down and whispered, "I see," and honestly. The way she said it was more chilling than any scream because she had this look in her eyes like a surgeon about to start an incision. For the next hour, Margaret was a nightmare. She spent the whole session talking down to Alina, calling her firm's data cute and ambitious for a boutique shop, and at one point, she actually patted Elena's hand, not a handshake, but a patronizing petand told her she should be grateful to even be in a room with real legacy. Alina just took notes, her pen moving across the paper with this rhythmic, hypnotic scratching sound, and she even nodded along when Margaret insulted. Her upbringing, mentioning how surprising it was that someone from the public school system could understand complex debt restructuring. It was brutal to watch, like seeing someone get bullied in high school, except the stakes were billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. And Margaret was enjoying every second of it, savoring the humiliation like a fine wine. Around 2:15, Alina checked her watch, stood up, and apologized because she had to take a mandatory compliance call. And she walked out into the hallway, leaving us in that suffocating room. I followed her out a minute later to grab some water. I saw her standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Chicago skyline. And she was on her phone. Her voice was so low I could barely hear it. But I caught 4 words. Trigger the morality clause. She didn't sound angry. She sounded bored, like she was ordering a salad. And then she just hung up, took a deep breath, and walked back into that lion's den with a look of absolute serenity. When she sat back down, Margaret was mid-sentence, complaining about the catering. And she didn't even acknowledge Alina was back until about 10 minutes. Later, when every single phone on that table started buzzing at the exact same time, It was like a swarm of cicadas had suddenly invaded the boardroom. And I watched the chief financial officer, the guy who usually looked like he was made of stone, turn a shade of gray that I didn't think was biologically possible. He fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking so hard he almost dropped it, and he looked at Margaret with this terrified, wide-eyed expression and said, "Margaret, they're out." Margaret frowned, her brow furrowing as she snapped, "Who's out? What are you talking about?" And the CFO just pointed a trembling finger at Alina, who was calmly closing her laptop. He stammered that Obsidian had just filed a formal withdrawal with the SEC, citing a violation of professional conduct and ethical alignment under a specific clause in the preliminary agreement. Clause Margaret's own legal team had insisted on including to protect them from scandals. Because the meeting was being streamed and recorded, evidence of Margaret's unrefined comment was already being clipped and shared among the institutional investors. And within 3 minutes, the $3 billion lifeline was gone. But it wasn't just the money. It was the signal it sent to the market. Because when a firm like Obsidian pulls out and cites morality, it's like blood in the water for shark investors. Margaret's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. And she screamed at Alina, "You can't do this. You're bluffing. We have a contract." But Alina just stood up, smoothed out her skirt, and looked at Margaret with a level of pity that was absolutely devastating. Alina told her, "The contract you wrote requires mutual respect and professional decorum to maintain the funding structure. Margaret, and you just broadcasted to the entire world that you don't possess either." And she added, "You thought you were the one in control because your name is on the building, but in this room. I was the one with the checkbook, and I don't fund people who think they're too big to be human." As Alina walked toward the door, the room was in total chaos. Executives were screaming into their phones. The stock ticker on the wall showed Sterling Vane's shares dropping like a stone, losing nearly 25% of its value in under 20 minutes, and Margaret was just standing there, frozen, her silver hair finally starting to fray at the edges by the time the sun went down that day. Margaret Sterling was no longer the chairwoman of the company her father had built. The board had fired her in an emergency session to try and stop the bleeding, but the damage was done. The Handshake incident was trending everywhere. It's funny, isn't it? How a woman who spent 40 years building a fortress of ego lost, all because she couldn't spend 3 seconds being a decent person. I saw Alina a few months later at a charity event. She looked exactly the same, calm, elegant, and completely unfazed in. I asked her if she ever regretted pulling the plug so publicly. She just smiled and said, "Some lessons are expensive, but they're the only ones people actually remember." It makes you think about the people we encounter every day. The ones who think their position gives them the right to treat others like shadows. And it makes me wonder how many of us are sitting on our own clause, 8.3, just waiting for the right moment to show someone that respect isn't a luxury, it's the price of admission. I've seen people defend Margaret, saying business is tough and Alina was too sensitive. But was she? Or was she just the first person with enough leverage to actually hold a mirror up to a bully's face? I'd love to know what you think about this, as I see this kind of thing happening in small ways all the time in offices, in neighborhoods, even in families where someone thinks they're untouchable until the ground disappears beneath them. Have you ever been in a position where you had to choose between a huge opportunity and your own dignity? And did you walk away, or did you swallow it? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think Alina went too far, or if she did exactly what needed to be done to change the culture of that industry. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that your value isn't defined by someone else's inability to see it, then share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own power. And don't forget to subscribe, because we're